Hi, this is the introduction to the genre podcast. One thing you need to understand before you listen to any more of these is the fact that the basic terms used all the time throughout actually refer to earlier podcasts, and in particular, the definitions of theme and story. So if you've not actually listened to those podcasts, it would be worth your while going back and listening to the basic 8 themes, including things like the fear of death and the pursuit of love, or dealing with the idea that story is about character motivation and not some great big plot device. And so therefore one is looking at only 10 stories in the whole history of narrative. And therefore, having taken a look back at those, or rather listened to them, you'll have a chance to understand how they're used when it comes to identifying and working the genre. What I want to do in this particular podcast is run through the 4 main genre groups relevant to feature film. Now, obviously, there are genres that relate to TV and other areas, but the feature film is the one where most people seem to stumble around genre in the most awful way. But also, it's the one that's most easy to understand. Having grasped the 4 main groups there, it's easy then to translate them or amend them or add to them when it comes to looking at things like television series, etc., or novels. Now, the feature film 4 main groups, as I explained last time around, are essentially horror, thriller, the romances, and perhaps the most contentious of all, personal dramas. In order to understand the difference between these, one needs to look at, as I said last time, at the various different groups that exist within each genre group itself that leads you to the particular genres we have in modern contemporary film. So, for instance, within the thriller genre, we have the psychological thriller, often seen as a sort of romantic thriller or psychological drama, but actually is very much about the nature of death and between 2 people. You then move on into the more politically driven thrillers, often seen as conspiracy thrillers. These have become dominant within a sort of action genre mode over the last few years, but for quite some time operated at a very personal level as well, and is still very common within European traditions of conspiracy thrillers or Latin American cinema or Far Eastern cinema. You then have, of course, the old action thriller, the sort of James Bond type operation, the sort of protagonist against the world, and every sort of 10 seconds an explosion, a car chase, or a plane taking off. These are very much often around the idea that there is a villain out there that we all know, but there's often a conspiracy element thrown in, just to keep you thinking. And then there's the sort of area of thrillers that works in a slightly different way, which is the murder mystery. Now, the murder mystery actually is a variation on the investigative thriller, the last main thriller group. The investigative thriller is different from the conspiracy theory in one fundamental aspect, which is that the investigative thriller relies on a professional investigator at the heart of them, and the same is also true of the murder mystery. Now, the murder mystery is old hat. It's the idea of the old Miss Marple type investigator, or even to a certain extent Sherlock Holmes. It's the idea that a murder is committed very early on, there's a range of possible suspects, and one has to eliminate or identify who out of this group of people was actually responsible for the murder, or ultimately murders. Whereas the investigative thriller is still very much with us in the mainstream of film. Here we have the classic professional detectives, investigators, private or public, who go out to actually uncover a truth and ultimately the villain or the murderer. In this sense, these are the 5 dominant genres groups within the thriller genre as a whole. When it comes to romances, there are only 3. And we discussed them a little bit in the last podcast, i.e. the dramatic romance, the tragic romance, and the romantic comedy. I won't dwell on them more here because we'll spend more time on them in future podcasts. When it comes to horror, there's been a lot of debate about horror over the last 10 years as its popularity has ebbed and waned, but it's now arisen as a major sort of commercial operation. And there are many, many types people fear, and people talk about teen horror and gore horror and porn horror, etc., etc. But in essence, the basis of understanding which horror group you're working with, if you are in fact indeed in a horror group, is to look at the antagonist. There are 3 main types of antagonists that drive the horror genre forward. There is the dead, in all their different forms, the deranged or mad, and the very nature of life itself, the supernatural. So those three give you three main genre groups within the whole genre of horror. And this leaves us only with personal drama. Personal drama, many have seen in the past as just simple drama, or have not seen as a genre at all, this being the area of the personal film. But in reality, over the last 30, 40 years, it's become very obvious that what has often been defined as independent cinema or as art house cinema has in fact just simply been personal dramas. And there being 5 groups within that genre. The first of these is the inner drama. Probably the most difficult to do in cinema until recent times. People had often struggled with this, the idea of representing the inner workings of a human being's mind on screen, and not either turning it into some laughable, surreal metaphor or some hazy cinema camera work. But works like The Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind and Beautiful Mind, we've seen very, very redolent examples of an inner drama being worked out on screen. You then move on into the domestic drama. This is the closest to so much television work, and personal drama dominates a huge amount of television. Within cinema, we're looking at personal drama in family relationships or work relationships that are not driven by romance, but driven by other ideas. And we'll come on to those in more detail when we look at this genre group as a whole. From there, you move over into the communal drama, or what might be called societal drama. The idea of individuals or a group of individuals being in conflict with the society they live in. An open conflict, a real contest between who's right and wrong in a particular scenario. Then you've got the rites of passage. Now, rites of passage is often taking place in a societal context, but is focused very much on the idea that the person has to move from one state of life to another, often obviously depicted as a teen drama, but often in recent cinema history being about old age, which is being captured very much in Far Eastern cinema and European cinema over the last decade. Or, in some cases, the old middle-age problem. Children have grown up or have gone off to university or whatever, and the parents are left with a semi-empty house and the question of what is their life going to be now. These are all rites of passage moments, and they've all been dealt with and will continue to be dealt with within this genre, within cinema. And then finally, there's the epic genre, the one where personal lives take place against epic change, major societies waging war against each other. And this is often literally the situation, of course, of personal dramas in a war setting. But it also happens in issues around struggles for independence, such as Gandhi or Lawrence of Arabia, and can also be found when you're dealing with vast historical figures and looking at the way that their lives were shaped, or in some cases how they shaped the nature of a society throughout history. So there you have it, the 4 big genre groups: the thriller, the romances, the horrors, and the personal dramas. From now on, in the next podcast, we'll look at each genre in turn